Auzubillahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Alayhi Mahdiin wa sallim taslima. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to another episode of our series. My name is Alia Al-Mahdi. So last time we discussed the mechanism of this religion and how it's generally practiced. Today I'd like to go a little bit into what exactly this religion of Shia Twelver Islam is about. How does it come into being in the sense of what exactly is the meat of this religion? And is it authentic? Is it original? Is it something that we find coming through revelation from God himself, from the prophets and messengers and the imams themselves? Or is it something a little bit different? I'd like to go into that a little bit in today's episode. So to start off, let's just look very quickly into, according to the popular opinion of scholars, what exactly is it that formulates Islamic law? So according to popular opinion, we find that there are four main fields that are looked into when it comes to formulating Islamic law or putting it down onto pen and paper and actually putting it into practice. And those four are the Quran, the Hadith, Ijma, as they call it, which means consensus, and Aql, or reasoning and logic. So this is a very interesting breakdown. Let's look at it for a minute and see whether or not it can actually truly hold water. Just to clarify, this breakdown or this criteria that have been placed to understand Islamic law and jurisprudence, it is not something that was particularly said by God through revelation or in the Quran or the Hadith that this is exactly how it should be. This is basically an analysis that was made by scholars of the religion, and then they put it down and organized it in this fashion. So let's take a look at what exactly it is that the scholars of Shia Twelver Islam came up with. We see Quran itself as a source of guidance, but not the sole source of guidance. And for sure it cannot be, because in practical terms, majority of the scholars agree on this, that the Quran by itself is not enough to guide the people. While Quranists have a different perspective on that, it's very clear that the Quran is incomplete in terms of explaining how to perform certain practices, such as the prayer, for example, which happens to be the first pillar of Islam, and many other such examples. The Quran by itself is not enough, although it is extremely critical and necessary as a source of guidance. We are now left with the other three apparent criteria or fields that are required to understand religion. And those are Hadith, Ijma, and Aql. Very quickly, Ijma, which means consensus, would take us to another interesting realm, which is, do most of or all of the scholars agree on a certain principle or a certain law or a certain teaching? And that by itself is very interesting and fascinating, because it is extremely rare to find any one agreement or any unified agreement between the scholars concerning any matter. So that's, again, a fallible human being perspective that we're looking at when we look at ijma or consensus. And to be very honest with you, if you go through the teachings of particular scholars in Shia Twelver Islam, you'll find that they are not fully convinced themselves with this notion, because in practical terms, it is quite tricky to put into practice. And then you have the fourth, which was aql, or reasoning, which again takes you back to logic and having opinions. We discussed that to some extent in the last episode, but very quickly I'd like to just summarize that in terms of aql, we said last time that aql has its place. Logic and reasoning have their place in life. And when it comes to revelation or truth or facts, there isn't much space for that when you already have a higher authority that you submit to that decides for you. Now, let's go to Hadith, the final point in these list of criteria. Hadith is undoubtedly a very critical part of understanding the religion of Islam. Hadith is undoubtedly extremely necessary in order to know how to live our lives as Muslims, or how to practice the different aspects of Islam, and even to understand how religion came about, what the history was, and etc. So Hadith is very important, and that goes without saying. But what is very fascinating is how exactly is Hadith studied? How exactly is Hadith understood? What are the criteria that we look at when we look at Hadith and narrations of the 14 infallibles right now in this day and age? How do we do it? And why is this so critical? Well, majority and a lot of Islamic law is based on the Hadith. So an understanding of Hadith is very critical. Now, if we look at today's day and age and we realize that the religion of the Shia Twelver Islam today is formed by the ideas and understanding of fallible scholars, then it stands to reason that we have to understand how it is that they're doing it. So let's take a look back into history and see how it all came about. By the time that the 12th Imam, Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari, went into occultation, by the time he went into occultation, there were certain characters that had come onto the scene. And these individuals were sheikhs, they were scholars, and they are very largely responsible for the hadiths that reach us in today's day and age from the Shia side of things. Okay, so we're talking now about these titans, you could call them, of the formative years, as they're mentioned to be, of Shia Twelver Islam, or the madhab of Shia Twelver Islam. We're talking about Sheikh Sudduk, we're talking about Tusi, we're talking about Kulaini. These names must be familiar to you if you are well versed in Shia Twelver Islam. And they were very largely responsible for what we know today to be the hadith of the Shia. What exactly happened? Now, when the Imam, from him is peace, went into hiding, went into occultation due to the lack of support from the Shia themselves and from the Muslims at large. When this great tragedy happened, that the Imam was forced to go into occultation due to the lack of support of the people, certain individuals rose onto the scene and said to themselves, let's collect whatever we know from the infallibles, from our imams, from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his daughter, peace be upon her. Let's take all the narrations and hadiths that exist and see what we have. So it is not surprising, although it is very fascinating, that 14 generations of infallibles, of ma'sumin, who were Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his daughter, and the 12 imams, these generations of pure people had said a great deal of very important and necessary information. And this information had been recorded and narrated and put down as hadith. In total, it came about to around 400 books of narrations. And we're talking right now about a time period which is the minor occultation of the 12th Imam. So about 400 books have been, at this point, seen to exist that have in them narrations and hadiths. That's a lot of information. What happens next? We find that these titans, these individuals who were considered to be the legends that actually rose and took charge of the situation of all this information, they said to themselves, let's collect what we think is authentic. So they decided to take those books and to go through them and to see which hadith, by their criteria and their understanding, was authentic, and which hadith doesn't make sense and can be considered not important. They collected these hadiths that they considered were authentic, and they boiled it down to a different number of books, not 400, not 300, not 200. In fact, the number of books that were remaining from their studies and their compilation and their analysis of what was authentic or not authentic, the number of books that they came down to were then 4. And those 4 books were very critical in the understanding that we have in today's day and age of what's authentic hadith or not. The 4 books I'm referring to are Al-Kafi, Al-Istabsar, Al-Tahzib, and Man La Yadr Al-Faqih. So Sheikh Sudduk, Tusi, and Kulaini, they were instrumental in doing this analysis and this compilation. Now, this is very fascinating. First of all, I'd like to bring your attention to the fact that the years in which this was taking place are called the formative years. The Shia Twelver Scholars, they call those years the formative years, the years in which these individuals took those hundreds of books and decided what was authentic from them and presented their conclusions as the most authentic and the most verified hadith. They call this the formative years of madhab of Shia Twelver Islam, and I personally would very much question that particular sentiment, because as someone who who is striving to obey and follow and submit to the one God, who believes in Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and who believes in the 12 Imams, I would say that the formative years would be in the time of Muhammad and Ali ibn Abi Talib, and not in a time when the Imam of the time had to go into occultation and was no longer within sight. That by itself is a giant red flag and a strange question mark in my opinion. But in terms of these four books, it has to be understood, are now the four books that these fallible people decided were the authentic hadith. How did they understand this to be the case, and what exactly is it that validates their understanding of what's authentic or not authentic? Let's look at that, because obviously there must have been some sort of background from which they're taking this understanding of what's authentic or not authentic in terms of hadith and narration. And I'm going to now take us to a particular science, and that science is called the Ilm Al-Rijal, or the science of men. What exactly is Ilm Al-Rijal, or the science of men? Basically, it is a science by which scholars decide to analyze the biographies of narrators of hadith. They analyze the chains of the narrators of hadith, and they check and they see whether all the links of the individuals who are narrating the hadith from the Prophet ﷺ or from one of the Imams all the way up to themselves in the book that they're holding. They analyze and they see, does this chain make sense? Are these individuals in the chain making sense to me? Are they reliable? Are they good people who should be trustworthy or considered trustworthy, etc.? So this science may seem to be an interesting science and something that makes a lot of sense, but it is a very foreign idea to the origins of Islamic teachings from the Quran and from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Ilm Al-Rijal in and of itself is actually an innovation. It's not something that was advised. It's not something that was taught by the Imams. It's not something that was encouraged to do. It is something quite random that popped up, quite frankly, out of nowhere in a time period when the Imam himself was no longer visible to the people. Now, why is that important to understand? It's important because according to what we believe in, religion should come from revelation. Religion should come from God himself. There are those scholars out there who try to justify this by saying, well, it's just a science, and like all sciences, it should be something that we accept and we allow to grow and to help us use so that we can understand the religion better. But we're not talking here about medicine. We're not talking here about physics. We're not talking here about astronomy. We're not talking about an actual field of science that exists in today's day and age on this realm, on this earth. We're talking about facts. We're talking about revelation. We're talking about truth. And truth doesn't evolve. Truth is truth. There's something that could be true or false, but it's not something that can develop in its truthfulness over time. So Hui, another great scholar of the Shia Twelver religion, disagrees. He thinks that, no, Shia Twelver Islam needs this science, so that, in fact, they say that without this knowing of the science and without applying the science, you cannot even be considered a mujtahid, or someone who can be followed by the people. So they consider the science very necessary, and they say that it can actually evolve, and it can evolve our understanding of hadith and of religion and etc. And another interesting fact about Ilm Al-Rijal is that Ilm Al-Rijal is actually not a science that was inspired to the Shia themselves. It was actually adopted as a science from the Sunni school of thought. So here is again another aspect of Shia Twelver Islam that has nothing to do with Ali ibn Abi Talib. Rather, it is an adopted tool that was taken from the Sunni school of thought after years and years and years of the Prophet ﷺ being among us. So it's not an authentic part of Islam. Yet it's considered to be necessary and critical. It's even wajib, obligatory, for a mujtahid, a scholar, to study that science and apply it in order for him to consider himself a mujtahid. If Ilm Al-Rijal is true, if it's true that we have to know from a fallible man and his analysis and his study that a hadith is authentic based on his study and based on his criteria and understanding of what is a reliable chain of narrators and who is reliable and what makes them reliable, if that is true, And if the Sunnis were right about it, then let's take an example and test the waters. Let's see by their standards whether or not this actually applies. I want to take us to a very interesting hadith. It's a hadith that can be found in one of the most Sahih books of the Sunnis, Sahih al-Bukhari. Let's read the hadith together. So from Sahih al-Bukhari we find this hadith. It says, the Prophet passed by Ammar and removed the dust off his head. And he said, may Allah be merciful to Ammar. He will be killed by a rebellious, aggressive group. Ammar will invite them to obey Allah and they will invite him to the hellfire. Okay, so this hadith that we saw right there is present in Sahih al-Bukhari. I want to take your attention now to something quite interesting. This particular hadith is actually mentioned in another book, and the book itself is very critical because it takes us back to the Science of Men. What does the Science of Men say, or the Ilm Al-Rijal say? It says that you're supposed to take from trustworthy individuals. You're supposed to take hadith from people who are known and respected and noble, and you're supposed to check if the chain of that hadith, the chain of narrators for that hadith, is actually valid. And there's a lot of criteria that they have for this kind of science. I want to go to a book called The Biographies of the Noble Ones. It was written by an individual from the Sunni school of thought. His name is Al-Dhahabi. Let's check out one of the pages in his book. Now, if you look at this page, it says at the very top, this page, this chapter of the book, it's talking about an individual by the name of Duhaim. Duhaim is a character, a person who's actually the one from whom many of the Sunni scholars would take their hadith, including Bukhari. What does it say about Duhaim in this part of the book by Al-Dhahabi? It says here that the judge, the imam, the faqih, meaning the one who can make fatwas or verdicts, and who's very learned in jurisprudence, and the al-hafiz, which means, and the one who's memorized a great deal of the narrations and hadith. Okay, so this is who Duhaim is, according to this book. And if we go to the next page, now here you can see at the very top, it says here in Arabic, it says that, and the ones who would take hadith from him, because he's considered so trustworthy, were including Bukhari, Abu Dawood, Nisai, and Qazwini, and so on and so forth. It's a long list of narrators or scholars who would take the hadith of Duhaim and consider his hadith to be very trustworthy, so it must be valid, it must be authentic. All right, so it says at the bottom of this page a very interesting conversation where someone is talking about something that Duhaim said about the hadith that we mentioned earlier. So when we were talking about the killers of Ammar, the hadith itself says that the Prophet ﷺ said that the killers of Ammar will be the transgressors. Somebody mentions this to Duhaim. And according to this book that's considered to be very authentic, Duhaim says that whoever says that those transgressors were from Sham and those are the ones who are referred to in that hadith, he basically says, whoever says that is the son of an unrighteous woman. A woman who goes beyond her bounds and does not adhere to marital laws, let's say. So he basically is kind of cursing whoever says anything about the Fayat al-Baghiya, or the people who transgressed. And he's saying that those people who are mentioned to be part of the ones who killed Ammar, they're wrong. He's just denying the whole thing completely. And if we continue in that chapter and we check out what it says right after, the writer of this book, Al-Dhahabi, he says something interesting about Duhaim now. Let's see what he says. He says that by seeing this, by knowing this about Duhaim, it can be considered that there is a little bit of nasb in Duhaim, or hatred towards the Ahlul Bayt. Now, please understand that we're seeing a science here that the Sunnis are following, the Sunni school of thought is following, where a man who is considered to have a bit of hatred of the Ahlul Bayt, he's being vouched for by others who are trustworthy in the same school of thought as having a little bit of hatred of Ahlul Bayt. That man is considered to be so authentic that Bukhari and others like him, who are also extremely authentic according to the Sunni school of thought, they are taking hadith from him and putting it into books. And then those books are considered completely authentic of hadith. Now, why is this important to understand? It's because clearly there's discrepancy in the people who are narrating hadith. So if we go by the standards that whoever narrates the hadith has to be completely authenticated and validated as totally trustworthy, and thaqa and all these titles are given as suduk and all of this, if we're going to give them those titles and then analyze the hadith as trustworthy, clearly it's not working. It's not working in the Sunni school of thought, and the Shia have adopted that science as their own, which is very alarming and strange. We just tried out a little practical example of whether or not the science of men works. Now let's actually look at the Quran and the Hadith and see if the science of men or Ilm Al-Rijal has a leg to stand on at all. Let's go to a verse in the Quran. This verse is from Surah Al-Hujurat, and it says, "O you who have believed, if there comes to you a disobedient one with information, investigate." So the verse itself in the Arabic, it says, when there comes to you a fasiq, investigate, lest you harm a people out of ignorance and become over what you have done regretful. The verse is saying, if a fasiq comes to you, investigate the matter they come with. Don't completely reject it and consider it irrelevant immediately. Check it out, study it, analyze it, research, find out what's going on in case you regret later because you said to yourself, well, that person's a fasiq, I can't take from them. What does fasiq mean? Let's look at the literal meaning of fasiq according to the dictionary. So it says here, there's a long list of meanings for the word fasiq, none of which are very positive. As you can see, fasiq is being described as someone being immoral, uninhibited, obscene, adulterous, lewd, reprobate, immoral. It's a long list. Fasiq is not a good person, okay? A person who is a fasiq is someone who goes over the boundaries and someone who shouldn't really be trusted. Yet the Quran is saying if someone who you don't trust, who's immoral, who's disobedient, if they come to you with a matter, check it out, investigate it. Because, hey, maybe you reject what they're saying and it's a bad idea to reject what they're saying. This is from the Quran. Now I want to go through a few hadiths that actually talk about the idea of rejecting hadith. So Abu Abdullah minhu salam says in this hadith, do not belie the hadith. If it is referred to us, meaning us the imams, for you do not know, perhaps in it there is something from the truth. Otherwise, you would end up belying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on top of his throne. Meaning basically, if you find out there's a hadith and it's referred to us imams, don't just deny it, because maybe you're denying something that is from us. Then there's another hadith that's even more stern about the matter. It says here, I heard Abu Ja'far minhu salam say, by Allah, the companion of mine is beloved to me who narrates and ponders over our hadith. And the evil one is the one who hears the hadith which has been associated to us and has been reported from us, so his mind does not accept it, meaning, and then his mind is not able to accept it, and his heart is constricted by what is in it. So he fights against it and he denies it. And he denies to make it his religion. And he does not know that it could be the hadith which is coming from us and to us is its link. So by that he has exited out of our wilaya or our guardianship. The hadith is basically saying that Abu Ja'far minhu salam, he's saying that it is not a good idea to hear a hadith and to analyze its content and see whether or not it's making sense to you, because here's the thing. Maybe it's constricting your heart. Maybe it's uncomfortable to you. Maybe you're finding it to be problematic as a hadith, but it's still from us. So the Imam is saying, despite that happening, you cannot reject it, because perhaps you reject a hadith that is from us, and then you exit our wilaya. You're no longer considered a Shia of us. So we now see from the Quran and the Hadith itself that rejecting Hadith because it doesn't meet a certain standard or criteria from the science of Ilm Al-Rijal, doing so is not encouraged, it is discouraged, it is spoken against. It's also very fascinating when we look closely at the structure now of Islam, and we compare that religion and the way it's studied and the way that content is studied in the religion and the way that it is analyzed and the way that it is divided and authenticated by fallible men. We see this system that's currently being run in the religion of Islam. We compare it now to religions that Islam rejects, such as Judaism and Christianity. And we find ourselves seeing that, to be very honest with you, They have very similar structures now, and they have a very similar understanding of how it should work. We find religions holding on tightly to books that they claim are authentic. We find religions that are not prepared to invalidate what they think is true based on fallible opinion. And this is problematic. But it's not surprising, because Prophet Muhammad ﷺ actually prophesied that this exact thing would happen. We have this very incredible hadith again. And this hadith is actually in Bukhari. It says, the Prophet ﷺ said, "You will follow the ways of those nations who were before you, span by span and cubit by cubit, so much so that even if they entered the hole of a lizard, you would follow them." So the companions asked, "O the Prophet of God, do you mean the Jews and the Christians?" And he, peace be upon him and his family, responded and said, "Who else?" Meaning the Prophet Muhammad said, you will actually be following in the footsteps of the Christians and the Jews. And in today's day and age, we don't see that there is much different between the organization and the structure of all three religions. So most likely the question that everyone is wondering is, well, then how do we do it? What should people have done? What's the answer? What's the right way of doing things? If you have all these different narrations upon narrations, you have all these laws that are not understood and need to be understood, and you have laws that aren't even made, that don't exist. Who's going to make them? How are we going to know what's right and what's wrong? Very valid problems, valid issues. But for sure, the solution is not to blindly trust and follow fallible individuals who consider themselves to be the guardians of this religion now, because they are scholars, who think that they can sit now and analyze hadith and tell you and tell me what's true or not true from this book, simply because they have studied some books. When the truth is from God, and truth is from revelation and not from opinions of people. This is definitely not the solution. But there is a solution. And it's actually a very simple solution. Some might consider it idealistic, but it is nonetheless the solution that God himself provided us with. And that solution is that we understand that God has said, both in his Quran and on the tongue of his vicegerents, that he will never leave the people without a guide. And that there's always an imam of the time. There's always someone to go to and refer to. There's always that link between man and God. There's always the vicegerent of God who's present on earth. There's a hadith that says, whoever dies and does not know the imam of their time has died the death of ignorance. Meaning there is always an imam of the time. And the question that people should be asking is, who is the imam of the time and where is he? And if we don't ask ourselves that question, then we end up doing things like creating sciences that God never authenticated himself. The religion of God, a religion that God himself vouches for, has to be a living, breathing religion. It has to be a religion that can stand on its feet and fend for itself. Not a religion that requires people who are not provided with the mysteries of the heavens and the earth, who are not infallible, who are simply scholarly, to stand up and create and formulate a structure that God never came up with. Because that is not authentic or originally from God. That is a made-up religion. So what God comes up with is the true religion that is living. Because religion is a man. And this is what we know today from Imam Al-Mahdi. This is what we know today from Abba Sadiq, from them is peace. Religion is a man, meaning that while there is a man from God, and there is always a man from God, the religion is living. The religion is alive. You have someone to solve your problems. You have someone to talk to. You have a link between God and yourself. You have to have that hijab, that veil between God and man. But if you find yourself in a religion where there is no man from God, where you are simply sitting silently wondering and hoping that you're on the right track because a man in a turban is telling you that he knows better than you do, if you find yourself following a religion of that nature, then question it and wonder if you're actually hearing God's words or if you're hearing the opinion of somebody else, someone who's not God. Because you can't have both. You can't have God and the opinions of people in the same place. Revelation and reason are not equal. If you're following a religion like that, consider it to be dead. And understand that the Imam of the time has appeared. He always is here with us. He's always got someone that he's sending to the people. In today's day and age, we have with us Abba Sadiq, from him is peace. Religion is very much alive. The religion is a man, and it's Abba Sadiq. We don't have to rely on the science of men to understand God's words. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.